noticed in our research on Urban Dictionary and the Cambridge Guide to English Usage is that they both try to modernize themselves. They both attempt in some way to make their content relevant to a 21st century audience. And I guess the overarching question that we came up with to encompass both of them was, how precisely do they attempt to make themselves relevant? First of all, both of these resources deal with digital data in different ways. Cambridge stresses its reliance on computerized databases, and furthermore claims that it is the first of its kind to do so. So on the first page of the preface, the author of the Cambridge Guide to English Usage states, "The Cambridge Guide to English Usage is the first of its kind to make regular use of large databases of computerized texts as primary sources of current English." Additionally, the Cambridge Guide stresses that this reliance on computerized databases is a way to be more impartial in its considerations of what makes a word standard in certain contexts and what makes it non-standard, because it allows them to see how frequently a word is used in certain contexts. Furthermore, I think that's a very interesting definition of what makes a standard, because in many other usage guides, authors tend to talk of elevating standards or maintaining a certain standard. In other words, the standard is made into this idealized form of English. The standard is what English should be at all times, whereas the Cambridge Guide does not agree with that statement at all. The Cambridge Guide to English Usage basically claims that if a word is frequently used within a certain context, then that in and of itself makes it standard.
Speaking of non-standard,
The first sentence of this definition is extremely informative.
non-standard is sometimes used as a label in dictionaries and language references as a way of marginalizing words, idioms, and spellings of which the authors don't approve. It seeks to identify a single standard form wherever alternatives present themselves. Newer forms are typically excluded, and the standard is thus liable to become tied to a particular time and style of language.
Right,
Which is exactly what we're going over with usage guides, other than Cambridge, dealing with this standard ideal where they believe that they're trying to uphold something in the language, whereas they're just giving a definition to what they think standard should be. It goes on to say the terms standard and non-standard need constant scrutiny to ensure that they do not short-circuit the recognition and consideration of alternative forms of expression.
Basically, it acknowledges that the term non-standard can be used as a way to deprive certain usages of their legitimacy, and that is extremely problematic according to this usage guide. And I feel like that's a very modern stance on language usage. It's a way of appealing to a language culture that is constantly changing. Whereas Urban Dictionary obviously is entirely comprised of digital data.
And non-standard words.
Yeah, lots of non-standard words.
Lots of non-standard words.
In fact, one could say that it is comprised exclusively of non-standard words. And in a way, I guess that I would argue that the very existence of Urban Dictionary asserts its impartiality by being completely open to all users to edit. There is no registration process at all for someone to become an editor or to become someone who votes on particular submissions. And I mean, the very tagline of Urban Dictionary is define your world. It places all the responsibility, yes, it places all of the responsibility on its own audience. I mean, it can be influenced by the various biases of its users, but the dictionary itself is technically open to
Anyone
all,
who can access it.
Yeah, anyone who can access it, all opinions, all viewpoints, it does not matter.
Peckham and Julie Coleman say in their article, approximately 37 million individuals access Urban Dictionary each month. Granted, we don't know if those are unique individuals, but those are how many hits they're getting. But it's understandable because the data that we got were from different years, first of all, and second of all, the Wikipedia page did specify unique individuals, whereas this only says individuals, so I'm assuming they're just counting 37 million hits versus... Anyway, but their percentages, according to those 37 million hits, were 58% male, 61% live with their parents, and 70% live in the United States, which, with the 37 million, we can assume that is true because the percentage is taken from the overall total. So, math-wise, that makes sense. I spent a lot of time doing math to figure this out.
It's such a cute little sheet. Just look at it. I should hang it up on my refrigerator.
Oh, I'm such a proud mama. Yeah. So I figured out that 76.7% households reported they had internet access in 2010. 74.9% of those households were white, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So a large amount of those households were white demographic.
I seriously think you see that reflected in the fact that one of the most commonly searched for words on Urban Dictionary is swag. Like, for 6 months in a row, it was the #1 word.
From such a high percentage, it's safe to assume that 25,900,000 users giving hits to Urban Dictionary a month, a majority of them are white, and according to the journal, 58% are male. So the most
there is
people,
definitely a skew.
The people making the definitions, voting on the definitions, are mostly white males, younger males living with their parents.
Even though Urban Dictionary is technically accessible by all, I think these demographics really explain why you see certain condemnatory attitudes towards certain dialects. Like, for example, let's look at the entry on Ebonics for a moment.
Oh yeah!
Let's look at that!
Let's look at that! I actually looked this up during class.
Alright, I want the privilege of reading this all
Yeah.
loud. The very first entry on Ebonics here is a poor excuse for a failure to grasp the basics of English. When in doubt, throw an isl sound in the middle of any word of just string random thoughts together and insinuate that they actually mean something. When backed into a corner, you can always claim that it has something to do with a sort of symbolism or is a defining trait that makes your race great, versus own up to the fact that it is essentially laziness at its finest. Also, this contains a very blatant grammatical error. That's really sad.
Failure to grasp the basics of English right there.
Oh, that's beautiful. I would like to contrast this with the obviously much more academic work of the Cambridge Guide to English Usage. One of the ways in which this guide attempts to modernize itself is by emphasizing the fundamental equality of English dialects in its very preface. It admits that it does not focus on all dialects, it only focuses on American English, Canadian English, British English.
But at least it's aware of what it's talking about.
Whereas and it basically talks about how to make your writing as approachable and accessible and readable as possible given the audience that you're presenting yourself to. It's very much geared towards a global audience, and even though Urban Dictionary is technically accessible by all, it isn't exactly it isn't exactly approachable by all. And I think that's a very interesting distinction to make, this question of accessibility versus approachability and what that has to do with how well these works will survive into the 21st century. An explicit statement that summarizes that. The quest for a single international form for written communication becomes more pressing among those aiming at a global readership. This book is designed to support both global and local communicators. It identifies regionalized elements of usage, grammar, and style with systematic attention to American and British English and reference to Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand English as well. It allows writers to choose styles and usage appropriate to their readership according to how local or large it is.
That's wonderful.
Yes, it's really wonderful. In short, it allows a lot of personal agency on the part of anyone who chooses to use this particular usage guide. It's explicitly respectful of local linguistic practices while acknowledging that there are sometimes global audiences that need to be addressed, and so it makes sense to have some sort of unified overall standard. Urban Dictionary is liable to be outright hostile sometimes because it reflects the hostility of sometimes it's very misinformed and uneducated users.
No research goes into
Absolutely
their
none.
definitions
I mean, you can
sometimes.
basically just make things up if you want. I mean, one of the rules is technically that you cannot use Urban Dictionary for posting in-jokes, but people do that all the time.
Yeah. That's almost the purpose of it.
Yeah, basically.
It is there for entertainment, as we said in our last video.
Uh-huh.
But at the same time, it doesn't have accurate definitions at all.
And because it is a commercial enterprise, it is a place that sells coffee mugs and t-shirts and that expects donations from its users. So basically it has to keep itself open to the kinds of user input that it wasn't originally designed for, because it's fundamentally there for the entertainment of its users. And even if they're using it in non-standard ways, that's something that
They just have to deal with that because
Yeah.
the consumer dictates what they put out.
in this passage, Cambridge seems to be addressing certain types of professional concerns. And so it's addressing a slightly older, probably more employed audience. This is a document that is going to acknowledge professional concerns about globalization in a lot of ways. And one of those ways is by acknowledging dialectal differences.
Whereas Urban Dictionary exploits that to a point where they're downright racist sometimes.
Racist for humor. With Urban Dictionary, you have a very non-academic, user-governed type of source that's very voting-oriented and community-oriented, in which the dominant opinions are likely to be white ones. And intolerance towards other racial groups can easily flourish. On a slang dictionary, this often manifests in extreme bias or outright condemnation of non-standard dialects, which is in stark contrast, obviously, to Cambridge.